How's it going? I'm Maitham. I'm the founder of M10. Welcome to this session on designing Web3-powered game economies. And over the next 20 minutes, I want to share a more structured, practical approach to how we can build these economies, particularly drawing on lessons that we've learned from the last few years of different experiments in Web3 gaming. We've seen what works, we've seen what doesn't work, and we have, I think, the right pieces now to figure this puzzle out. And so just a bit of quick background on M10. We're a next-gen gaming studio building a fresh kind of shooter on Sui with a very deep, player-driven, open economy, and we're leveraging new business models to really take it to the next level. We've been also working with researchers and economists from some of the top universities, and also some of the first economists on EVE Online. And so we've spent a lot of time really trying to figure this out. My personal background has been a lot on just building new economic systems. My gamer credentials is very much FIFA Ultimate Team, spent sort of 10 years digging into that, and was also one of the sort of big traders there. And so I kind of want to approach this as sort of foundational layers that we can stack on top of each other, each one being more fundamental than the prior. The most important thing to start with is a strong conceptual framework of what Web3 in games is actually good for, right? What the problems are, what problems can it solve, what problems can't it solve. And I think it's fair to say that actually most gamers just don't care about owning your assets for the sake of it, right? The idea of owning your assets in principle. And honestly, why would they, right? 99% of the games that they sort of play, it doesn't really matter if Web3 is integrated to that. Think about it. You only really care about 1 to 2 games that you're really addicted to, not the sort of tens or hundreds that you sort of get to try, right? Now, if you're the developer of Fortnite, Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, okay, the principle of owning your assets starts to be interesting. So what is Web3 in games actually good for, right? Turns out owning your assets so that you can then trade them for real money, that's very interesting. And I promise that's an important distinction. Just tradability alone can be a huge driver for engagement and monetization. And we've seen this in CSGO, FIFA Ultimate Team, EVE Online, and real money trading kind of takes that to a whole new level. And so the next logical question might be, well, okay, I believe you, tradability is good. Don't we have sort of Steam Marketplace and Web2 tech for that? And actually, you're partially correct. We don't need Web3 for tradability, but it is absolutely essential for certain things, specifically bootstrapping liquidity and royalty enforcement. So we have stuff like NFT AMMs and AMMs more generally, and that allows games to sort of tap into the deep liquidity pool that is sort of crypto, right? It's very, very, very hard to do the same with sort of Web2. And enforcing taxation, again, you have certain smart contracts that allow you to enforce taxation, royalties at almost the very, very base level. There are so many ways to bypass tax in sort of Web2. You can PayPal a friend, or there's just plenty of social ways to bypass this. And that's kind of the vantage point I want to focus on for this talk. If we simply take these 2 simple things that Web3 unlocks, we can start to unravel the interesting benefits, and we can start to design this incredibly powerful, rich games from just these 2 simple principles. And like I say, the real goal is actually 10x monetization, 10x engagement, and I think this is absolutely possible. And so it's first important to understand what your North Star is, right? What you're really optimizing for in this new economic format. In traditional free-to-play, most of your revenue comes from direct sales of virtual goods. The tax rate is effectively 100%. And since the enabling feature of Web3 is secondary markets with lots of real money trades, here it's all about growing the total economic value being exchanged within your economy so that you can then tax it. A better mental framing of this is actually the distinction between a country and a company. With Web3, you effectively have a virtual country where your main objective is to actually promote economic trade and activity, again, so you can tax it. Many Web3 games that we've seen try to double dip and do both. This generally leads to a lot of pain and attempted sort of double dipping. Some developers want to be the company, sell items to make revenue, and then also have the benefits of a country, right? And a lot of the research we did with some of the economists showed us that actually this leads to a lot of cannibalization. When you have both primary and secondary monetization, and you try to make them both work as effectively, they just eat into each other and you leave with less money. And so, I obviously want to make a case for, really leaning into sort of secondary monetization models. And so, once you decide to think about yourself more as a country, more about like sort of growing this GDP, then the big question becomes, well, how do you actually drive sort of economic activity for this tax model to be worthwhile? You can't just sort of flip a switch on and hope, the same design loops that work in free-to-play will work in this sort of new economic paradigm. And so, you really need to focus on continual production, consumption, trade. These are sort of the cornerstones for building this kind of economy. Again, all comes down to growing GDP. And so, I think the first foundational stack here is that, choosing the right genre. This is the single most important decision that you can make. This is because if the core feature of Web3 is tradability, well, whether we like it or not, some games are better suited for that than others. All games aren't created equally. And for that secondary market to really thrive, players need to stay engaged for months, if not years. And you really need to have a shot on goal of becoming sort of this forever game, or at least sticking around for a long time. And this is often because there's a compounding effect for your economy, sort of as it grows, as it becomes more stable, as the risk of your economy lowers, and you start to see more and more capital flows into your economy. And actually, there's a point in time where players stop seeing your economy sort of just as a thing where they just spend money and start to look at it more so as somewhere where they can build long-term economic identities. Games like CSGO and sort of EVE Online have achieved this status where players are willing to hold ships, assets, all sorts of other stuff for very long periods of times within these economies. And so there are certain archetypes of games that are just better than others, right? Games with large TAMs, long lifespans, high skill curves. Much of this is just games as a service 101. And it's all oriented around like constant content production to keep players engaged, fresh content coming from sort of emergent dynamic gameplay, hence, PvP, multiplayer games where there's a lot of fresh action and battle between players. That's super important. And what we don't want is certain things like high hardware costs, right? Inaccessible skill curves. And actually, repetitive content that lacks depth is also pretty bad. Not only is it boring, but it also leads to the same problems that the first wave of play-to-earn economies faced, which was that there was no real economic cost to produce some of these items, and so speculators were able to come in and exploit that. So okay, now that we have those, now that we've chosen the right game genre. In a lot of typical traditional games, players often focus and rely on a singular linear progression loop, right? An example is like, you level up your character, you gather resources, you get stronger, all by yourself. And in that setup, you rarely need the help of someone else to really progress within the game. But if you want to build a deep economy with lots and lots of trades, players shouldn't be totally self-sufficient, right? We want players to rely on each other, to need each other. And that's why multi-loop progression is so important. And you can do this by sort of breaking your game into distinct loops. Maybe some would specialize in resource gathering, some would specialize in crafting, some would specialize in dungeon raiding, territory expansion, you name it, right? And each loop yields unique resources and benefits that other loops just simply cannot replicate. And so progression generally in the game is very tough in isolation. And so, in most cases, you need other players to trade with, to collaborate with. And again, this is very important for driving volume. I'll give you a good example in terms of like real-world economies. They serve as like the perfect case study for this. The better trade relationships a country has, the faster it can grow or progress, right? The inverse is also true, right? Sanctions are used to stop countries from trading with each other, and therefore it slows down its rate of progression. We really want to encourage real collaboration and trading. An example of this within sort of a game economy context would be, maybe the crafters need rare herbs from sort of the gatherers. Maybe the fighters need advanced weapons, potions, whatever from crafters. And so you've constantly got this interconnected, deep economy where sort of the supply chains are sort of very deeply linked and players constantly need each other, right? And constantly need to trade with each other. And like one final thing I'll mention on this is, of course, each of these loops have to be deep in importance. We want players to specialize and build careers effectively within these loops. And there's a massive bonus point if each fundamental skill required for each of these loops is also very different, right? The next layer is this ability for the player to engage in positive sum actions or value creation, right? Players need to find ways to create value through activities or services that truly expand the total value of the in-game economy, rather than zero-sum systems which sort of move value around. And so value creation really hinges on this idea of marginal cost of production, right? Marginal cost of production that needs to align with consumption demand. This cost isn't money, right? The marginal cost of production in typical free-to-play games is money. You give me $5, I give you an item. In this sort of economy, to really start to grow it should and could be skill, time, luck, risk. And a player might need to, example would be a player might need to invest hours of skilled play, craft something aesthetically unique, maybe risk losing items in a tough dungeon, or get lucky in a rare drop. And this is sort of the effort expended to produce items, do services, and just create experiences for others within that economy that actually serve like some sort of in-game utility, right? Not just mere speculation. And by contrast, I'll try to give you an example of like zero-sum, negative-sum loops. This is where value is redistributed. And actually, oftentimes when speculation is involved, it actually not only fails to grow the economy, it actually starts to make it collapse. And so yeah, without positive-sum systems, the game economy is going to be fragile. It's going to be very speculation-driven, and it's just not going to be sustainable in the long run. The next layer to consider, if you manage to achieve the previous one, is real money economies inevitably trade speculators because there's money to be made. And look, that's not inherently bad, but it's dangerous if your game lacks true customers or if speculators can extract value from genuine players. Ideally, the ideal relationship you want to create between the speculator and your gamer or consumer is one that actually mirrors public markets. This is where companies are the ones that create value, and investors or speculators provide financing or liquidity. They are able to supercharge value creation, but they're not able to capture as much as sort of the consumers, the gamers that actually create that value. So first, you actually need to make sure your game has real consumers. This is, of course, this idea of like entertainment value that people get from playing rather than just making money. And that means making the game, of course, genuinely fun. So a big segment of players are just willing to spend time and resources for enjoyment alone. Because the reality is that it's not going to be sustainable for everyone in your economy to make money. Some people just need to be consumers there for the sort of entertainment value that they can get from the game. Beyond that, you also need to have robust systems so that anyone trying to make money can do so through first creating value and then capturing some of that value. So people that make money within this economy have to be ones that actually create value and then get to capture it. Again, this kind of links back to some of this idea of like positive sum value creation, where players can generate important resources or do services for each other, but need to inject their own skill, time, luck, or risk for this, right? Again, the past play-to-earn models failed because they promised everyone a profit. Instead, only real contributors, those who produce something of value for others, should be the ones able to make money. And so as a game developer, your job is to make sure that you've designed the respective systems and channels from which players can actually create value. And a lot of this comes down to your game's content pipeline, right? And what in-game content you're trying to monetize. And so you build systems that allow gamers to create those sort of items that you need, whether that's cosmetics, power items, whatever. Another very crucial part of your economy is sinks. Without this, your game will get inflated to infinity and sort of it'll collapse. A wise person once told me that sinks are this thing where you take a little bit of short-term pain versus a lot of pain in the long run. EVE Online famously does this through its destruction system. They smartly tie this into the core loop of the game itself. And these huge battles with permanent destruction or sort of ships and equipment being destroyed. And again, this wipes out, as it shows here, a massive part of their economy, and it's like a mega sink. There are other systems, and you really need to figure out ways to make them feel natural and for them to really fit neatly within your game. And you also need to figure out like the right amount of aggressiveness. If it's too little, they won't really make a dent in your economy. So again, your economy will just get inflated to infinity. Or if they're too aggressive, well, it's going to drive people away, right? Players are going to churn. They're going to feel it's too aggressive. Some very quick examples of real sinks would be durability, where you need to repair your gear, or players need to spend resources to repair their gear. Another one is perhaps crafting, where players need to make tough choices around what assets they sacrifice to get something else, right? And yeah, I mean, like, it's only when you've sort of really mastered and progressed through these very foundational layers is when you should really start to think about player-owned virtual currencies. This one is like super, super difficult, and to be honest, no one has cracked this, but there are some general principles we've learned from watching others. The most important one, in my opinion, is that the currency should be like completely player-owned, 100%, because the design function of a tradable currency is it's a medium of exchange. It needs price stability. But as soon as you have investors, team, whatever, that own like, I don't know, 20, 30, 40% of the token, all of a sudden they have a vested interest in making the token go up, not to maintain sort of stable value. And so you kind of don't want that, right? You want to make sure that your currency is stable and it's not some sort of, it's not like a equity where you're trying to make the price of it go up. Another thing is probably to make sure you don't launch it too prematurely before there is a real player-driven economy with sort of a real need or utility for this currency. It just ends up being overshadowed by speculation. It's this idea of like GMV before GDP, right? And so, as you can probably tell, building an economy with real money trading is not easy, right? It's a lot like trying to take the core design of a real country and trying to build an entertaining game or fun game around that. But I think like the proverbial treasure really is worth it, and we're not just talking about sort of quite literally 10xing the monetization and engagement in gaming, which could of course change the face of gaming completely, but it also creates like deeper, richer experiences for gamers to really enjoy and allows people to like actually create careers out of this, right? If they manage to create value within your economy, they're able to like make real money and capture some of that. And so just to take this full circle, the core principles really are using Web3 for its best and most obvious use cases, creating real money trading economies within video games where you can sort of bootstrap deep liquidity and enforce royalties, sort of creating a new business model. And then with these tools that you have, designing your economy for maximum player-to-player trade. And again, that's all about growing GDP. And then we want to do this through multi-loop progression where players are able to specialize in different careers, different archetypes. They're able to contribute. They're able to sort of create value. And they're able to specialize and collectively progress further. And of course, protecting yourself against speculators by creating systems that allow sort of creators to actually capture the value versus speculators. And great, if you manage to figure all of that out, well then that's when maybe a virtual currency starts to make sense. And so this is a very basic Web3 economics sort of one-on-one. I hope that helped. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Telegram or talk to me. I'm at not Maitham on Telegram. But yeah, I hope that makes sense.